Hello! Instead of being a racist today, I thought about maybe talking about Conlangs instead. You know, shit like Dothraki and Klingon. Considering my channel is pretty small, I skipped the introduction to the basics, and we'll link a video by artifaction instead. As you know, there's a thing called IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, and if you don't, click the video in the description. It's basically a system which is used to classify all the sounds in the world. This is the best resource that one can use for it because it's an IPA chart with sounds, so
I, Ö, Av,
you can hear all the sounds and the exact small differences between very similar sounds like
Da, Ada, Da, Ada.
yeah, very minor difference. So first, some advice on how to choose the letters. When I first started conlanging, I just picked the ones that sounded most fascinating and just looked the fanciest. But there is actually a little bit of a science behind that. Those lines here denote actually how the sound is pronounced. And people have a tendency to pronounce sounds in a similar manner. For example, if a language has this T,
Da, Ata.
there's no way it's gonna have this D, because people will just move their mouth in a way that's more similar to those. As such, when it comes to vertical lines, very often letters just keep in the same language to those same vertical lines. It's just simpler. It's much less. Of course, as with every rule, you should always have an exception because that makes it set up. It makes it seem more natural. With vowels, it's much more random which ones will come up and which ones won't. But that makes it honestly a bit easier. I usually just choose those ones which I can already pronounce. There's much less to choose from anyway. So, how do I usually go about choosing sounds? First, I think what I want to do with my calling. So, let's assume I want to make a dwarven language. So, you just go to Wikipedia, and you should have the IPA chart for Icelandic right about here. And you can just print screen and insert it right into your doc. Right. You quickly insert the chart of Icelandic and you see that there's some characteristics sounds. For example, p and p. The H on the top means that it's aspirated. It's actually pretty interesting to always add those diacritics because they can change a lot about the language. So, if we have the set of letters for Icelandic, let's make our dwarf language. Let's make an IPA for our dwarf language then. I'm gonna simplify because the dot means that it's voiceless. Icelandic is a little bit of an odd language where you can have essentially d and t are the same sound. You can but t is voiceless. You can theoretically write a t as a d with a dot. Those are essentially an equivalent way of writing it. So I'm gonna simplify the Icelandic a bit by leaving out the voiceless ones and the aspirated sounds. So it becomes m. This sound would be written as no, and this one would be written as is the hang in the English. Hang. It's actually not an ng, but it's actually its own sound here. Then a p, t. This sounds actually like a sh. So I'm gonna leave it out and replace it with a sh, the sh in English. Just simplify then I'll add a g, because why not? Then this sound is and this one is a voice, so that would be, and those are romanizations. Those are not IPA symbols. This is essentially how you can write them when it comes to your romanization. There's actually also a bit of an art romanization, but I'll cover that in a later video. Then the y is actually, I'll use the IPA y sound, so yeah, not a j here. The X is actually a similar thing to ha, so I'll just replace it with a ha. And then the same with the L and R. Now for the vowels are not that important. So I'll just choose the most basic ones. It's a Dwarven language, so it shouldn't have many vowels to begin with. So E-O. I'll also put in this sound because it's Germanic sounding sound, even though it can be written like this, for example. Yeah, very good to go. The phonology is based off a Nordic language because that's what the best result is. You can invent your own phonology from the get-go, but it's much harder. As you see, a lot of the letters keep to one category. As you see, a lot of the categories in the IPA chart are completely unused. Now you think, okay, I have the phonology, what comes next? Next would come another thing which I would say decides the sound of your language way more than the letters, because the letters to some extent fall under individual pronunciations and stuff like that. So there's a specific notation for writing syllables. So CVC means that your letter always has to have two consonants and one vowel, and it can't have any more consonants or any more vowels. A natural notation could, for example, be, of course, it broke, and another C. That would allow for the creation of, for example, or just a simple uh. So tglur and are both valuable sounds. But you don't want these three consonants to be able to cluster in any way they possibly want. It would be stupid. So that's why you have to introduce what's called clusters, and you have starting clusters and ending clusters. The thing with clusters is they're sometimes pretty annoying to write. For example, in this case, let's say I have those three voluntary consonants. That would mean that I have to type out every single possible cluster. Let's say that would be inconvenient to type out every time. As such, you can type out a single letter here instead. That means that these two would form a cluster, but this one is just counted as a letter, which means you don't include it in the cluster. So let's say your clusters are instead written as, which in this case implies that the L can be put basically in between any letter. Now, I here also want to have something that I find very interesting for Dwarven languages. I saw first someone I know do this, which is permitting semivowels to also replace vowels. What does that mean? That, for example, a y and a w can pretend to be vowels. So let's say instead of having a word like tuva, you can have a word like tuv. There is basically a possibility of using things that are not vowels as vowels, and that's described in what's called the sonority hierarchy. The sonority hierarchy basically describes how, if I had to say it the most simple, it's which sounds are the loudest, or something like that. It's a very odd system, which I don't really understand, but you can hear it when you say it. For example, A is the very tippity top of the sonority hierarchy, with E and O being, and as you see, the vowels like E, U, E, and U are all in the same category, with then things going slowly down. R, so the flat, then the laterals like L. Actually, it's pretty weird because I did see semivowels be used as vowel replacements, but as well I did see nasals. Nasals, if you want to make an African sounding language, it's a good idea to use them. Like if someone here sees a word like mkebe, they instantly just hear, yeah, nigger speak. Those words or syllables would be allowed with our order. But how do you standardize it then? Basically, you write all the possible starting clusters based on the sonority hierarchy. The sonority hierarchy works in a simple way where the vowel at the middle is supposed to be the highest sonority sound, with everything climbing down. So it's something like up, 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 high point, and down, 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 down. Very easy. So as we see, this rule is fulfilled here because Z is about about that sound. That sound is here, and here's the Z. There's actually a trick to make things also sound a bit more specific when you want to use the sonority hierarchy. For example, say something like URL. That flows super well because the U, R, and L are very close to each other in the sonority hierarchy. Sounds rather soft, right? If you want to make a language sound kind of harsher, allow for much higher jumps in sonority hierarchy. So let's say A, V, K, AVK, AVK. Sounds much harsher already, doesn't it? So let's imagine some random clusters in our Conlanging. So and then some ending clusters, which would be like, and so on. One thing which I really like to do is putting in one consonant cluster which breaks the sonority hierarchy. In this case, I would use maybe this is something I do because I noticed that some languages, in a lot of languages, the one break in sonority hierarchy sounds very characteristic. Like an example for this is Nahuatl, the Aztec language. The tl sound basically only comes up there. It's because it's an illegal ending TL cluster. And if you put it in any language, Conlang, etc., it instantly screams Aztec. It's just so characteristic. The thing with tl is, it's actually a pretty rare sound. It's not like it comes up in every word there. You can hear it like every 2-3 sentences. So it doesn't come up that often, but because people just speak and speak, it just jolts out. If you're making a conlang, let's say for a book, I would make the characteristic sound, actually this would be an ending cluster, the characteristic sound come up way more often. Let's say once every 2 words. That is simply that people associate it with the language. It's basically the fingerprint of the conlang. If you're making a spoken conlang, so like not for a book or maybe you're using it in a play, you can pay way less attention to this sort of advice. Then there's another thing. Another very, I would say minor, but later rippling thing when making a conlang is how often do you use letters? When making a conlang, people are often very tempted to go, let's say, very regular. When I made my first conlang, I had some very odd sounds in it, which was the first mistake, which was just thrown around all of the IP. But the second mistake was trying to have all the sounds come up basically at the same frequency. So let's say everything is at 2, always it's the same. And I would actually like check my notes if I used all the sounds the equal amount. And only later did I find out that in natural languages, this is for English, because that's the easiest example to find examples for, we see that the frequency of letters falls really quickly. And you might not be inclined to think to yourself, okay, I'm just gonna check for the amount of letters I put into my vocabulary to use like frequently, and I would say, yeah, that's not that easy. Because this chart doesn't count the frequency of letters used in vocabulary, it counts it used in a text. I can showcase that this basically works. This is a random text I wrote for a description of a plant for a role-playing game. And if you do Control F, you can check how many letters here are. So E, 860, then T, 667, and A, 614, which basically perfectly corresponds with this chart. Why is that? It's not because E and T come up extremely often in English in every single word. It's because of the word the. It's the by far most used word in English, and that way it just skyrockets those 2 letters, which are already pretty commonly used. In this list, we actually see a steady fall of, if you wanted to like count it on average, like if you wanted to plot it, I played around with it before, it would be about 1/6 of 1/6 fall. But because it also depends on a huge amount on like where you put said letters and what types of words, when I make a conlang, I usually go like I make it 1/10 more common in my vocabulary, And then you have to think about what words do I need? So the most common words and certain grammatical phrases just need to contain certain letters to make their frequency boosted. For example, if you make a language which has a grammar akin to English, you would use this list. This list of words is pretty good because those are the most used. The list of words in English used by frequency. You can use it to essentially put the sounds you want to have common in it. Then the second thing to look at is grammar. Plurals are used extremely often. If, for example, you see the frequency table, if instead of the frequency, let's say, if the plural wasn't cats, it was cads, I wouldn't be surprised if S was catapulted all the way here, while Z would be catapulted all the way here. Because plurals are something used very often. So if you, let's say, let's look at our Dwarven language once again. In this fancy Dwarven language, ny, this sound ny, is a pretty soft sound. I don't want it to appear that often, so I would just make sure to not put it in any grammatical constructions such as plurals or tenses. I would make sure to not put it in articles, other things like that. Simply put, it would appear in the vocabulary, but it would appear not very often. That way, when you write sentences, like, of course you won't get a perfect curve, but when making a language, you imitate reality, not create it like a map folder. To try to keep like, even you here see this is just not even a perfect decline. This is just like jumps, hoops, etc. And it's different for every language. I think that's important. It's like here the most popular sounds are ATA. For my Dwarven language, I would like, for example, the most popular sounds to be the most popular sound should be a vowel, so A. A because it's the highest in the sonority hierarchy. That way I can get those harsher jumps. It makes the language sound harsher. Then maybe I like the sound because that sounds kind of Nordic and Dwarvish, etc. So that we basically created the base of the language. We know how to make a language sound, let's say now Nordic or Dwarvish. How would you make other languages sound a specific way? Nothing. There's just characteristics things languages from different parts of the world do. If you want to emulate Japanese, you do simple syllables like na, ka, da, ga, etc. And more importantly, you end the syllables with an N. Because the Japanese structure of syllables actually looks something like this. Japanese syllables can only end with one letter, and that's N. If you take basically the same syllable structure, but replace N with S, you instead get Polynesian languages, which is like where you get weird phrases from like Meli Kalikimasu, which is basically Merry Christmas in Hawaiian, which is just a bastardization so they can pronounce it. If you want to make a language which sounds African, I recommend shit like Mgbu, so syllabized nasals, or how we did with Dwarvish, where we made semivowels active vowels. We can also say make and just act like a vowel. So instead of Mgubu, it would be Mlebe. So here it acts like a vowel, also like a vowel. Like no, but like there's a very big difference if you say like words like Khrzan, Fert, and Kumklebe. You can just hear it. Clicks, while they're very characteristic for African languages, they literally only come up in Khoisan, are actually not very well known by mainstream people, and that's why I prefer to use them for like insectoid languages. But they're also very good for like making things savages. Okay, I'm gonna just show off just how clicks sound.
Ah, up, ah, 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 ah.
So I would use like clicks for insect people or like wild tribes because it's basically characteristic of the Khoisan. Then there comes obviously nasality. Nasality can be used in very different ways. It can be used very well to characterize French because French is known for its high usage of nasals, but it also can be used to emulate some Slavic languages. Same as umlauts like u, etc. can be used to characterize Germanic languages, but not like very Nordic ones, like German. Schlüssel, Brüssel. As for Asian languages like Chinese, it's very characteristic to have tonality. Tonality also comes up in African languages, but again, it's not that well known. And if you want to like play on stereotypes, like if people read tones or hear tones, they're not gonna think African guy, they're gonna think Ching Chong. So tones are a good thing to put in. Additionally, there's also something like uh, this is a rule of thumb, but the colder the region is, the more consonants and less vowels a word needs to have because it's quicker to pronounce. Whereas where further south you go, the more do the words have more vowels, less consonants. Additionally, that's basically only languages in the south have tonality. That's, I think, theorized to be because people wear like masks in the cold, and therefore some sounds gets muffled, and consonants just sound more characteristic and similar to each other than vowels, and you would fucking not be able to hear tones if you lived in the north. So if you like, even make, for example, if you want to make a language which is quote unquote Chinese, but living far north, you would take to a large extent the grammar of Chinese and the characteristic sounds of Chinese, but would, for example, delete a lot of the tones and a lot of the vowels. The only problem is that then you have to basically find a sweet spot where you make it still sound like Chinese without not being Chinese, and you also have to find a way to convey that in writing usually. Uh, that's basically as much as I know about that one. I might come back to talk about root systems, etc. in the next video.